And this is where things get controversial, right? We know the cow poops, that's got to be good for the earth. This is a natural fertilizer. And then the cow is going to burp out some of this methane. So this is where everybody gets all bent out of shape. Cow burps are killing the environment, right?
Yeah, and this is one of these things that if you have even a moment of time spent noodling on ecology, and again, like you mentioned, the vast herds of grazing animals, pre-Columbian era in the Americas, why was the planet not destroyed then? And and that's kind of a dismissal. Like, unfortunately, we have to kind of get in and be more rigorous than that. But it really is important to characterize what's happening in that animal-centric model as a cycle. Methane is released, methane gets exposed to UV radiation and is cleaved and gets transformed into carbon dioxide and water. That re-enters the carbon and the hydrological cycle. And that's fairly stable over time. Life is fairly stable in that regard. So there's a given amount of productivity. And you actually showed us a link from the FAO that was talking about how methane emissions have flatlined relative to the number of ruminant animals, which goes completely contrary to the narrative that folks are putting forward. But what's really critical to understand in that is, if we immediately vilify all greenhouse gas emissions as equally bad, then we end up in a really dangerous place. And I'll share a little bit of a personal story with this. A person that was very helpful with my first book. She ended up actually getting referenced and acknowledged in my first book. I had posted something about how it was discovered that shellfish produce enormous methane emissions, absolutely enormous methane emissions. And the end of the article suggested that perhaps these shellfish should be expunged from the seafloor, that we should have less life to protect life at large. And again, if you really buy into this notion that like all greenhouse gas emissions are bad, then this is kind of a reasonable, secondary, tertiary kind of thing. But if you are wrong about that, then you are making an absolutely fatal mistake. And she really took me to task on this thing. And I said, hey, I really feel like we need to have a more nuanced conversation around this, because if we get this wrong, we're going to enact all manner of policy from like the UN level down that could be incredibly injurious, and we may not really ever recover from it. And she said that anybody that questions the current narrative of climate change, she has noticed, is also usually a Holocaust denier. Now, this is somebody I've known for years. We had a good enough relationship that she got acknowledged in my book, but this is the degree of like, whatever, I don't even want to give it, like a label, but the commitment to this idea that all greenhouse gas emissions are bad. And what we've seen since then is there was a piece, it's in Finnish. Was that the Finland, Norway?
It was the Green Party in Sweden had proposed that we should kill all the moose in Sweden because they emit methane.
And this is where we are. And so termites emit enormous amounts of methane. Even peat bogs emit methane, but they net sequester more carbon than they release. And even in this story, if all of life sequestered all of the carbon and all the carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere, at some point it would all be gone and life would end. So this is another one of these things where there's a balance, and life itself, and the fact that we have a planet that turns and it has a geological cycle where there's subduction zones and volcanoes emit things, that is largely the reason why life functions and can function over enormous timescales. When the planet starts slowing down, when it doesn't turn as much, when there's not as much radioactive material in the core to keep things churning, life is going to find it more and more difficult to exist. And this gets really way out there in the weeds, but it's just critical to understand that this greenhouse gas story is important, but it's important to really vet it out and be crystal clear about, we're talking about this on the one side, with the basically life, And then we're talking about something entirely different with the really massive and rapid release of enormous amounts of both carbon dioxide and methane and some other potential greenhouse gases from the technology, the industrial food system, transportation, and all those sectors.
Yeah, and I think this is where things get nuanced, and this is what's so cool about podcasting, right? You could never have this conversation on the evening news, which is the tragedy of where we are today, right? We've just begun to unpack this, and this is going to get more complex and more nuanced as we go further in this podcast. But we are just beginning to scratch the surface of environmental science, types of different greenhouse gases. It's more than methane, it's carbon dioxide, it's N2O, it's CH4, which is methane. There are all sorts of greenhouse gases. And as you're pointing out, Rob, without greenhouse gases in our atmosphere, none of us are here today, because the surface of the planet is like 0 degrees Fahrenheit or something. It's crazy. Like, we don't have a planet without greenhouse gases. So there is some level of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere that is necessary for life on this planet. And this is not climate denialism. This is not saying that we should all just, large scale burn everything we want and, just pollute as much as we want. This is just saying, hey, let's take a deep breath and actually try and dip our toe into a very complex set of information around how the environment actually works. Because a lot of us, I'm not an environmental scientist, but it's tied into what I do. And we all have to educate ourselves here. And so many of these arguments against cows are just not nuanced, as we said. They're just saying cows, methane, greenhouse gas, climate change. It's like, it's more complicated. So I want to show this article that this page that I briefly shared while Rob was talking. We'll put this link in the show notes. This is a joint FAO IAEA program. And we will again talk about the FAO later in this podcast when we talk about ways that the FAO has been misleading in terms of previous studies they have done. But this is a website that just says that since 1999, atmospheric methane concentrations have leveled off, while the world population of ruminants has increased at an accelerating rate. You can see the two numbers here, and we're saying, wait a minute, you're telling me that cows are contributing all the methane, but cows are going up and methane is going down. And so people can dig into this in more detail. This is just all the ruminant livestock in the world, and you can see they're all increasing. But the conclusion here is from the FAO is pretty clear. The link between atmospheric methane and ruminant population growth seems to have broken down. This occurs despite accelerated increases in ruminant numbers without an equivalent increase on global methane concentrations within the current time frame. And they say, basically this challenges us to re-examine the notion that cows are the single greatest contributor. I'm just saying that this is the messaging from vegan plant-based groups is cows are the reason. Cows are the single greatest contributor to climate change. I'm not making this up. That's actually been said. And these things are like, wait a minute, that's crazy. I love that you highlighted this, Rob. Peat bogs produce methane, termites produce methane, landfills produce methane, moose in Sweden produce methane. This is crazy. This is part of an ecosystem. This is part of the carbon cycle. And so we can go back to that other.
And Doc, there was a little piece there even on that paper that it said that the possible reduction is from improvements in efficiency, basically that it's since World War II, like the industrial food system. It's also possible that the two things are not related at all, which is funny that the correlation causation deal, like they're so beholden to this notion that the emissions from life would be direct drivers of this process, where there was no assessment of the transportation sector is expanded, dramatically, and the use of plastics and, all of those are major vectors. And we kind of saw that within the COVID shutdown. And it's kind of hilarious in a way. We saw carbon emissions plummet while transportation and flights and all this stuff were taken offline. The number of cows and ruminants didn't really change, but yet the total emissions really dropped, and it was quite significant. And then the way that got spun was that now during the age of COVID, livestock plays an even bigger role in the climate change story because transportation was taken offline.
Proportionally, there's less transportation, so then the livestock goes up, and yeah, it's insane.